Hello, hello. I'm back as promised, and I'm going to be talking about white Canadian squirrel. So, Canadian squirrel is known for this variegated white and tan, sort of tannish brown hair. So, it starts off this sort of tannish brown color at the base and then turns white towards the tip. So, the reason why Canadian squirrel, or one of the reasons why Canadian squirrel is so prized, is because of the hair structure. So the shaft, the main body of the hair, is fairly thick and then tapers off toward a very thin tip. And the tips are very silky. And what this unique thick to thin structure does, it kind of acts like Kolinsky, where it's very resilient, or surprisingly resilient for squirrel, but the tips are still very soft and flexible. So Canadian squirrel, the normal tan variation, is usually used in eye brushes, as far as white Canadian squirrel brushes for eyeshadow brushes go, it's usually limited and usually paired in a set with something else. So this one is a limited edition brush. This is a small powder brush by Koyudo. It's fair size, probably good enough for a blush brush or a face brush for bronzer and powder. Well, as far as white Canadian squirrel goes, you can't really get it off the shelf. It usually pops up every year or every other year in a very limited run and then disappears. Your only other way to get it consistently is to custom order it from, say, Takeda or some other brush manufacturer that will make a custom brush for you. So as far as I can get from information, like I've spent a bunch of time scrolling through old listings for white Canadian squirrel brushes and regular Canadian squirrel brushes. The prices don't really differ that much. So for example, and I have this information linked in the description below, the white Canadian squirrel set from 2015 was a 6-piece brush set, a large, medium, small powder brush, and a large, medium, small eyeshadow brush. So that 6-piece white Canadian squirrel set from 2015 was about approximately $1,338. The regular Canadian squirrel set from that same year, 2015, was the same price, $1,388. But it's when we get to the more recent years that it becomes interesting. So this small powder brush that I'm holding was $270 in 2017. The 2019 release is $380. I checked the hair dimensions, same brush hair dimensions, slightly different handle, but the handle cost probably didn't factor in too much. But regardless, $110 is quite a leap for a 2-year difference. Interestingly enough, the Canadian squirrel brush released that year was only 2 millimeters shorter, but otherwise had the same dimension. And that year, I mean by 2019, that brush was $317. So I kind of wonder if at first they started out at the same price, but it kind of diverged as it went on. But from all that I know, it seems like Canadian squirrel in general is getting really hard to get. I have a blush brush that I'm afraid I can't show you right now because it's with a friend. They're borrowing it to test it out to see if they want to get their own. The blush brush I got in 2016 for $189, and the recent release in 2019 is $220. So that's not as big as a jump for the powder brush, and I will explain why. So Canadian squirrel is really hard to find in these longer hairs, which is why you usually find it in eye brushes. And the longer the hair, the more expensive it is, as well as the bigger the brush by volume, the more hair you have to pack in. So then your price just goes exponentially up and up and up. So that's why they're only able to release very pretty limited runs of these white Canadian squirrel brushes. So is the premium worth it? You're going to have to decide yourself. But as far as function goes, they're probably, I would say they're pretty on par. White Canadian squirrel is pretty on par with regular Canadian squirrel. So you have no problem picking up, say, a pressed powder. Just swirl it a couple times. I'm a little bit shiny right now. You can see it just mattifies it right away. And you can see how it kind of hugs to the face like your other classic squirrels do, gray squirrel, blue squirrel. You can see it fan out and then sort of hug the contours of your face. So it's going to be a very soft brush despite the fact that it is a little more bouncy, a little more resilient. So, do you need a Canadian squirrel brush? No, it's absolutely a luxury. A very soft goat brush, or if you're sensitive, a more thickly packed gray squirrel brush will do just the same trick. For example, the Z8 is a good one. It's a little thinner than this, but as long as your gray squirrel brush is very thickly packed, you're going to get approximately the same effect as the white Canadian squirrel or regular Canadian squirrel in a blush or powder brush. As far as my personal opinion goes, I um, I really love regular Canadian squirrel and eye brushes. I have a bunch of them. I kind of collect them. I don't have any white Canadian squirrel brushes in eyeshadow because, like I said, they usually come as a set, and I don't buy the set. I buy my brushes a la carte. So I don't have any white Canadian squirrel brushes to talk about. However, when it comes to face brushes or blush brushes, I chose the white Canadian squirrel over the regular Canadian squirrel because I do prefer the white tips. And I can kind of see the makeup on the brush versus with regular Canadian squirrel, the tips are already this tannish color, so it's kind of harder to see the pigment that you pick up. It's not really a huge issue, it's more of like a cosmetic aesthetic thing, but that's just my personal choice. I was thinking of destashing my white Canadian squirrel blush brush. And that is because with a regular squirrel brush, I can get pretty close to what Canadian squirrel feels like. However, in a blush brush. However, once you get to a bigger size like this, you can feel a bigger difference. So once you get to face brush sizes, if you put a Canadian squirrel brush and a gray squirrel brush side by side and just stroke them over your face, the difference you will feel is the amount of friction or lack of friction and how smoothly it glides over your skin. The tips are exceptionally silky on this one, like that feels like silk going over your skin, versus with Canadian squirrel regular, I feel a little bit more of a drag, but that may be from the particular brush I was working with. But all of my gray squirrel and blue squirrel brushes do have more friction as I'm gliding it across the skin. So I really like this one as a bronzer brush. So it works really well with soft press powders, as well as with harder press powders. Meteorite works excellently with. This is pretty much an all-around powder brush that works really well. Again, this is the small size. There's a medium and a large size. I found those to be extraneous and opted not to keep them, and those have been long gone by now. Well, actually, I trialed them, but I chose to buy my own small face brush because I do really like how it works. As far as fragility goes, in theory, Canadian squirrel is supposed to be more strong than blue and gray squirrel. However, I have not experienced hair breakage with any of my brushes. I'm pretty careful with how I treat them. So all of my brushes are going at least 4 or 5 years old. It'll lose a hair here and there, and of course my heart hurts every time. But overall, everything is very nice and even. Like there's no stray errant hairs just poking out and about. The one thing with Canadian squirrel versus white Canadian squirrel is how much it fluffs up. So this is what the brush looks like when I wash and dry it without a brush guard. A Canadian squirrel brush will be somewhere between like maybe 10 to 15% less volume. So the white Canadian squirrel does splay out a bit more. That's from comparisons I did with friends' brushes. I can't say maybe it was a washing technique thing, a drying technique thing, though we both dried it without a brush guard. Maybe it was a water hardness thing. But in general, that seems to be the case. So if you've read Sweet Makeup Temptations, aka Sonia's blog post on this, she also has the same observation where with a white Canadian squirrel brush, if you dry it, put a brush guard on it, and wait a while, you will end up with a smaller volume. And if you dry it without a brush guard, you end up with a bigger brush. Versus regular Canadian squirrel, you don't have as big of a variance in terms of volume. So to summarize, Canadian squirrel and white Canadian squirrel brushes, you don't really need them in blush or powder brushes. But if you were going to splurge and go for a really high-end rare hair brush, I would opt for the powder brush size, because at the blush brush size, because there's not so much volume that you can tell the difference, you're really better off substituting with a cheaper, they're still pretty expensive, gray or blue squirrel brush. It's when you get to this big size, like for example, when I compare this with the Z9, if I do this with the Z9 side by side, I can really feel the difference in the glide. Application-wise, there's nothing really that dramatic. If you have a pretty densely packed powder brush, the Z9 again for easy comparison, you're going to get pretty good pigment laydown and blending. So I hope that kind of enlightened you a bit on White Canadian Squirrel, what the hype about it is. The hype about it is really just that it's rare. It's not a common production thing. And actually with regular Canadian Squirrel, it's not a regular production thing either for some companies now. Hakuhodo has discontinued Canadian Squirrel in their permanent line. Some other brush brands have, off the top of my head, I can't remember them, but they are kind of getting harder and harder to find, and it's kind of like sending me into FOMO panic. So I'll just answer questions now. That's the meat of the video. Okay. This one is, let me check. This one, when I got it in 2017, was 270. They released one in 2019 with the exact same dimensions, just slightly different handle. They have an angled handle instead of a round handle on it. That was 380. So yeah, the price kind of jumped quite a bit in 2 years. And I guess if you're going to like buy brushes for investment rather than use, I guess Canadian Squirrel would be the thing to get. Do I like to pinch the pinch of the White Canadian Squirrel? Does White Canadian Squirrel powder come in a round shape? It does with Takeda. You have to, I'm fairly sure that they have a permanent model now that was created by some brush nut. They said they wanted a custom round White Canadian Squirrel brush, and then so many people saw that and wanted it, so they added it to part of their permanent line. I'm not sure who has it. I think it might be either Cecilia Lamb on Instagram, or it might be Christy 20_20 on Instagram, but they're really big Takeda people. So far, I only have Koyudo White Canadian Squirrel. So if you wanted to know what the differences are between the, I guess, different grades of White Canadian Squirrel, which company has the best, I would go ask them. Like I said, I'm probably not qualified to do this video because I only have collected 2 White Canadian Squirrel brushes over my brush career, but this is what I feel about these brushes, and they're really nice, but they're not necessary, like so many things. So thank you for watching. If you're new to this video, I've done 2 previous videos. One of them is on Koyomo, the ancient goat hair that was collected in the 70s, and another one is on Saibikoho hair. So this is the 3rd video in a series about rare or unusual hairs. And I hope you enjoyed and learned something, and I'll see you next time. Bye. And for those of you who were in the waiting room, thank you so much for your patience.